The morning Margaret Alcott shoved Eliza Whitmore's worn traveling bag off the boardwalk and into the frozen mud, in front of every soul on Blackridge's main street, nobody moved to stop her. Not the mercantile owner. Not the reverend standing 3 feet away. Not the cluster of women who watched from under their bonnets like birds on a wire, heads tilted, lips pressed thin with something between discomfort and satisfaction. Margaret's voice cut through the cold like an axe handle. "We don't run a charity house," she said, loud enough that even the horses heard it. "And we certainly don't take on cripples who can't pull their weight." Eliza stood in the street, bag in the mud, leg aching from 2 days on a rattling coach, 23 years old and nowhere left to go. If that had been you standing there, what would you have done? If you're watching this for the first time, hit subscribe and join this channel before you read another word, because stories like this one don't come around often. Drop a like on this video and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The stagecoach from Denver had deposited Eliza Whitmore in Blackridge, Colorado on the 3rd of January, 1876, just as the last gray light was being pressed out of the sky by a front of iron-colored clouds moving in from the northwest. She had $4.17 to her name, a bag containing 2 changes of clothes, a wooden-handled cooking knife, and a ledger book she'd used to teach herself accounting during the 2 years she'd spent keeping house for her cousin Helen in Pueblo. A cousin who had recently informed her, with considerable gentleness and no apology whatsoever, that her new husband found the arrangement uncomfortable. Eliza had thanked her cousin. She had not cried until the coach was a mile outside of town. She'd chosen Blackridge off a notice pinned to the wall of a Pueblo boarding house, a handwritten card advertising for a cook and supply manager at a cattle operation in the Colorado High Country. No name, no address beyond "Inquire in Blackridge." It was not much to go on, but $4.17 was not much to live on either, and the choice between uncertainty and starvation had never struck her as a difficult one. The leg had been with her since birth. Left side, the hip socket not quite formed right, the bone having compensated over 2 decades by growing in a direction that left her with a visible list to her walk. Not a stumble, not a drag, but an uneven rolling gait that most people clocked within about 4 seconds of watching her move. She'd had a lifetime to observe what happened in those 4 seconds. The eyes went down first, always, then back up to her face with a slight recalibration. An assessment. A reassignment of whatever category they'd initially placed her in. She was used to it. That didn't mean it stopped costing her anything. Blackridge was larger than she'd expected, maybe 400 people, a real main street with a hotel and a telegraph office, 2 saloons, a church with a bell tower still being built. The mountains rose behind the town like a wall that someone had forgotten to finish, white at the top already, the snow line sitting low. She had limped up the boardwalk with her bag and pushed open the door of the nearest establishment that looked like it might be a boarding house. It was a boarding house. Run by Margaret Alcott, a woman of perhaps 50, with the posture of someone perpetually bracing against a strong headwind, and the expression of someone who had not found the world adequately grateful for her efforts. The conversation had lasted less than 90 seconds. Margaret had looked at Eliza's leg, quoted her a weekly rate that was nearly twice what Eliza had seen advertised in Pueblo. And when Eliza had pointed this out, calmly, she thought, using only facts, Margaret had picked up her bag from where it sat beside the front door and walked it outside and set it on the edge of the boardwalk. Then, apparently deciding that wasn't clear enough, she had pushed it off into the mud below. "Go find charity somewhere else," Margaret said, already turning back toward her door. "You'll cost more than you're worth." That was the moment. Right there. The bag in the mud, the street full of people who'd heard every word and chosen to study their boot tops, and Eliza standing with her hands at her sides, and the cold working its way through her coat. She did not yell, she did not cry. She climbed down off the boardwalk, retrieved her bag from the mud, wiped it against her coat, and kept walking. The man at the mercantile told her, after some hesitation, that the notice about the cooking position had been posted by someone from the Hawthorne spread, Hawthorne Ridge, up in the North Valley, about 8 miles out. When she asked how to get there, he told her the road was rough and she'd want a horse. When she told him she didn't have a horse and wasn't asking about horses, he gave her directions on foot. She thanked him and went to sit on the bench outside the dry goods store to rest her leg and think. The cold was settling in harder now. She could feel it in the joint where the hip bone sat wrong, a deep specific ache she knew better than to ignore completely and better than to surrender to. She had about 3 hours of usable daylight left, 8 miles on a bad leg and deepening cold to a ranch that may or may not still need a cook, on the word of a nervous mercantile owner who'd had trouble looking at her face while he talked. She ate the last of her bread while she thought it through. Not because she was hungry, because she needed to think clearly, and thinking clearly required not being hungry. And this was the kind of calculation she'd been making her whole life. How to manage the body's deficits so the mind could stay sharp enough to work the problem. The problem was straightforward, if not simple. She needed the position. She had the skills. The obstacle was getting there and making the case before anyone had time to look at her leg and decide the answer was no. She stood up, adjusted the bag on her shoulder, and started walking north. She made it about a mile before the sky opened. It wasn't snow. It was something meaner, a mix of sleet and freezing rain that came in sideways off the mountains and turned the road into a gray slick almost immediately. Eliza pulled her coat tighter and kept moving, but her left leg was already protesting in earnest, the cold making the joint seize in a way that forced her to slow down whether she wanted to or not. Her boot found a patch of ice she hadn't seen in the gray light, and she went down hard on one knee, catching herself with both hands, bag swinging out to the side. She stayed there on the road for a moment. Just a moment. The sleet hit the back of her neck and the mud came up cold through her skirt. She had $3.89 left. She'd spent 2 bits at the mercantile for the bread. She was a mile and a half north of a town that had already told her what it thought of her, 7 miles from a ranch that probably hadn't kept her position open, and her knee was bleeding through the stocking. She got up. Not gracefully. She didn't have graceful. She had functional, and she used it. The sound of horse hooves came from ahead, from the direction of the ranch, and she stepped as far off the road as she could manage before a dark horse appeared out of the sleet, with a large man in a rain-soaked coat pulling up short when he saw her. He was on a working horse, nothing fancy, and he rode the way men ride who spend most of their waking life in a saddle, automatically, like he and the horse had reached some long-standing agreement about how things worked. He looked at her for a moment without saying anything. "You all right?" he said. Not warmly, but not unkindly either. The particular neutral of a man trying to assess a situation before committing to an opinion about it. "I'm fine," Eliza said, which was not entirely true but was close enough for the purposes of a stranger in a rainstorm. "You're bleeding." "I know." He looked at her bag, then at the road behind her, then back at her. "Where are you headed?" "Hawthorne Ridge." Something shifted in his expression. Not much. This was not a man whose face moved around a lot. But something. "That's 7 miles north." "I know that too." The sleet was getting heavier. She could feel her coat beginning to lose the fight with the cold, the fabric wicking moisture through to her shoulders. The man on the horse was looking at her with that same assessing expression, the one she couldn't quite read, and she made herself stand straight and meet his eyes and not look at her leg. "I'm looking for a position," she said. "Cooking, supply management. There was a notice in town." "I know about the notice," he said. "I put it up." She waited. "Caleb Hawthorne," he said. "Eliza Whitmore." Another pause. The horse shifted its weight, and he steadied it without looking down. "You walk all the way from Blackridge." "I took the stage from Denver, walking from Blackridge." He seemed to consider this, the walking from Blackridge, the sleet, the bleeding knee, all of it, for a long moment. Then he stepped down from the horse in one practiced motion and held out the reins. "Get up," he said. "I can walk." "You can," he agreed. "But that leg's not going to get you 7 miles tonight, and I need to know if you can actually cook before I waste both our time." He didn't say it with pity. He said it the way a man says something practical, something that is simply true and therefore worth saying. "There's a step on the left side of the road. Use it." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the step, a flat rock, nearly buried in the mud, but enough. She used it and got up. He took the reins and walked beside the horse, and she sat in the saddle with her jaw set against the uneven road put through her hip joint, and she didn't say a word about it, and he didn't ask. They didn't talk much on the way north. What conversation they had was practical. Her background, her experience, what she knew about cooking for large numbers, whether she could manage a supply ledger. She answered everything directly and without elaboration because she'd learned over the years that elaboration was how you gave people time to start thinking about the leg again. Short answers, clear competence, move on. You reorganized a ranch kitchen before? He asked. In Pueblo. 15 ranch hands, 3 meals a day. Previous cook had no system for provisioning and we were running short every third week. I built a rotation calendar and a supply chart. Wasted provisions dropped by about 30% in the first 2 months. He didn't say anything for a beat. What kind of a chart? A ledger-based system. Column for projected use, column for actual use, column for variance. You spot the patterns after about 6 weeks. Another pause. The sleet was easing slightly, or they were getting into the lee of something. A ridge, maybe, because the wind had dropped. How'd you learn that? I taught myself, she said. I had time. He glanced at her then, just once, the same assessing look as before, and she could tell he was thinking something, but he didn't say it. Hawthorne Ridge came out of the dark gradually. First the smell of wood smoke, then the glow of windows, then the silhouette of a long, low ranch house and several outbuildings against the slightly lighter gray of the sky. It was a working spread, clearly, and a substantial one. The horse moved into the yard and a ranch hand appeared from one of the outbuildings to take it, and Eliza climbed down more carefully than she'd climbed up, making sure she landed on the right leg first. The ranch hand stared. Caleb said nothing about it. He simply walked toward the house and expected her to follow. And she did. The kitchen was large and cold and had the particular chaos of a place where someone had been improvising for several months. Caleb lit a lamp and she could see it clearly. Mismatched storage, no inventory system, 3 different types of flour in unlabeled sacks, what looked like a month's worth of salt pork stacked against the wrong wall and already showing signs of temperature damage. She stood in the doorway and looked at it. Previous cook? She asked. Left in October. 2 hands been splitting the work since then. She turned and looked at him. He was watching her with that careful expression again, and she realized he was waiting for something. Waiting to see if she was about to tell him this was more than she'd expected, more than she could handle, too much trouble for a woman in her situation. I'll need paper, she said, and ink, and about an hour tonight to take inventory before anyone touches anything else. He looked at her for a moment that stretched enough to be meaningful. There's a room off the far end of the house, he said. Small. It'll do for now. I'm not asking about the room yet, she said. I'm asking about the paper and ink. Something that might have been the beginning of a different kind of expression moved across his face. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. He turned and went to find the paper. She stayed in the kitchen doorway, cataloging the disaster in front of her, already calculating how long it would take to build a working system out of this mess. Her knee was still bleeding. Her hip ached in the deep, specific way it always ached after too many miles. She was bone-tired, and she had $4 in her coat pocket, and she was standing in a stranger's kitchen at the edge of the Colorado mountains in the middle of January. She began to make her list. She slept that first night on a cot in the small room off the far end of the ranch house, and she did not sleep well, which was fine. She hadn't expected to. The room was barely large enough for the cot and a wooden chair and a peg on the wall for her coat, and it was cold in the way rooms are cold when they haven't been heated in months, the kind of cold that the blanket helps with but doesn't solve. She lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling into night, the wind off the mountains, the horses in the barn, the distant sound of men's voices from the bunkhouse tapering off. And she ran through her inventory list in her head because that was more useful than lying there wondering if she'd made a mistake. She hadn't made a mistake. She didn't have enough options for mistakes. In the morning, she was up before the lamp in the bunkhouse came on. She found the wood stove in the kitchen and got it going. It took 3 attempts because the flue damper was partially blocked with accumulated soot, something she noted in the mental list she was building of things that were wrong with this kitchen. And by the time the first gray light was coming through the window, she had water heating and had completed a preliminary inventory of everything on the shelves. It was worse than she'd thought the night before. Not catastrophically wrong, but wrong in the accumulated way of a place where no one with a system had been in charge for several months. Duplicate stores of some things, critical shortages of others, salt pork stored against an exterior wall that was going to be a temperature problem by February if it wasn't moved, and 3 sacks of cornmeal with the beginnings of moisture damage at the bottom seams. She tied these last 3 open and spread them on the table to check the extent of it, and she was still doing this when the first ranch hand came through the kitchen door. He stopped. He was a big man, maybe 30, with a red beard and the general appearance of someone who had just gotten up and was not entirely committed to it yet. He looked at the 3 open sacks spread on the kitchen table, and then at Eliza, and then at the sacks again. "Morning," Eliza said. "What's wrong with the cornmeal?" he said. "Bottom seams got wet. Checking how deep the damage goes." She showed him the discolored portion. "This half of the first sack is all right. The second 2 are salvageable if you use them in the next 2 weeks. After that, they'll turn." He looked at the cornmeal. He looked at her. He had the expression of a man trying to determine if he was being told something important or being managed. "I'm Eliza Whitmore," she said. "I'll be managing the kitchen and provisions." "Jim Cawley," he said. "I've been doing the cooking." "How long?" "Since October. Me and Pete take turns." "Has the cornmeal been stored here the whole time?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "I don't know where it was before. I just used what was there." "All right," she said. "I'll need you to move the salt pork today if you have a few minutes. There's a wall it should be away from before winter sets in properly." He looked at her for a moment with that assessing expression that she was already recognizing as the standard male response to being asked to do something reasonable by someone they hadn't decided to respect yet. She met his gaze and waited. "I'll see if I have time," he said. "Thank you," she said pleasantly, and turned back to the cornmeal. The salt pork was moved by mid-morning. She hadn't asked again. She'd simply made it easy, cleared the space it needed to go to, set out the crate to move it into, and Jim Cawley had done it between tasks without further discussion, which told her something useful about how he operated. The rest of the ranch hands came through the kitchen in 1s and 2s as the morning progressed, and she fed them what she could manage from what was available, which was eggs and the better portion of the cornmeal and salt pork from the stores she'd already assessed as sound. It was not impressive cooking. She hadn't had time to make it impressive, but it was hot, and there was enough of it, and she watched from the corner of her eye as men ate without the particular hesitation that indicated real dissatisfaction. Caleb came through last, after the others were already heading back out. He looked at the table, which she'd cleared and wiped down, and at the inventory list she was building on her paper. "Breakfast was adequate, miss," he said. "It'll be better when I know what I'm working with," she said. "I need to go to Blackridge for supplies, before the end of the week." "Make a list. Hector goes Fridays." "I'll need to go myself. I need to see what they have before I can finalize the provisioning rotation, and I have questions about the ranch calendar that affect the supply schedule." He paused with his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. "The ranch calendar. When you're at full crew, when you're short-staffed, when you're working cattle at a distance from the ranch house, it affects how I plan meals and what needs to be portable versus what can be prepared here. It affects quantities. It affects storage requirements." She looked up from her paper. "I can plan blind, but you'll get better results if I understand what the ranch actually does." He looked at her for a moment with the careful expression that she was coming to understand was not coldness but calculation. He was always calculating, always taking in information and assessing it before committing to a position. "Friday," he said. "You can ride with Hector." "Thank you," she said. He left. She went back to her list. The problem with the kitchen was not fundamentally a problem of supplies. It was a problem of systems, or the absence of them. Eliza had seen this before, in Pueblo, the way a working place without a proper provisioning system accumulated waste and shortage simultaneously, always running out of one thing while another spoiled unused. The solution was not complicated. It was just time-consuming, and it required the cooperation of people who had been doing things a particular way and were not necessarily delighted about changing. She built the system in pieces over the first week, Working around the daily reality of feeding 11 men 3 meals a day from a kitchen she was still inventorying, she established a daily bread rotation on the second day because fresh bread costs relatively little in labor once you've got the timing right, and it functionally improves the reception of everything else on the table. She reorganized the storage on the fourth day, labeling everything she could find a label for and building a simple shelf system that put frequently used items at hand, heightened bulk stores out of the daily traffic. On the sixth day, she found a second set of cooking pots in the back of a storage room that no one had mentioned, which doubled her capacity for large batch cooking and solved a problem she'd been working around since she arrived. It was during this reorganization that Nathan Hawthorne appeared in the kitchen doorway. She'd heard about him before she met him, from Jim Cawley, who mentioned him with the affectionate exasperation of someone describing a weather pattern they've learned to plan around, and from Hector, who said less but whose silences on the subject were themselves informative. Caleb's younger brother, 20 years old, had their father's land sense and their mother's disposition, which Hector delivered as if this were self-explanatory, and perhaps in the context of people who had known the family for years, it was. Nathan Hawthorne was tall, dark-haired, and possessed of the specific energy of a young man who has not yet found the appropriate outlet for whatever is driving him. He stood in the doorway and looked at the reorganized kitchen with the expression of genuine surprise that he made no attempt to conceal. "You moved everything," he said. "I moved most things," she said. The stove stayed. He came further into the kitchen, which was an interesting choice given that she hadn't invited him. He looked at the labeled shelves with the particular interest of someone who finds the implication of the thing more interesting than the thing itself. "Jim said you made him move the salt pork," he said. "I asked him to move the salt pork. He moved it. Jim doesn't do things he doesn't want to do." He picked up a jar, looked at it, set it down. "He moved the pork within about 2 hours of you asking. I made it easy for him to say yes," she said. "And I didn't make it about whether he wanted to. I made it about the pork going bad if it didn't get moved." Nathan looked at her with the openly curious expression of someone who is younger than you in ways that have nothing to do with age and is also, underneath the youth and the energy, considerably smarter than he looks. "Caleb moves things by telling people to move them," he said. "That works too," she said, "when you have the established authority to back it up. And you don't." "Not yet," she said. He liked that answer. She could see it. The slight shift in his expression, the recalibration. He sat down at the kitchen table without asking, which she suspected was characteristic, and stretched his legs out. "You were walking to the ranch," he said. "In the sleet. Caleb told me. It was where I needed to go. 8 miles. I'm aware of the distance." He studied her with the frankness of someone who hasn't yet learned to disguise his curiosity as something more socially acceptable. His eyes went to her leg once, quickly, the same way everyone's did, and then came back to her face. "Does it hurt? The leg?" She stopped what she was doing and looked at him. Most people, she had learned, fell into one of two categories on this question. They either never asked because they were too uncomfortable with the subject, or they asked with the particular quality of concern that was really just intrusiveness wearing a considerate expression. Nathan Hawthorne asked it the way he'd asked about the cornmeal, directly, with the straightforward curiosity of someone who wanted to know a fact. "Yes," she said, "in cold weather, particularly. But you walked anyway." "The cold doesn't stop because my hip hurts," she said, "and I needed the position." He nodded, as if this were entirely sensible, which it was. "Caleb said you organized the kitchen in Pueblo. For a ranch. 15 hands. 2 years. Why'd you leave?" "My cousin's husband found the arrangement uncomfortable." Nathan's expression shifted into something specific, the look of someone who has absorbed an injustice on someone else's behalf and is trying to decide whether to say something about it. He decided not to, which she respected. "You're going to be better at this than the last cook," he said instead. "That's a low bar," she said. "I've seen how the cornmeal was stored." He laughed. It was a quick, genuine laugh, the kind that happens before a person has decided whether the thing is funny. She liked it more than she expected to. "You'll do all right here," he said. Standing, moving toward the door with the looseness of a young man for whom physical movement is always slightly ahead of his actual intentions. "I plan to," she said. He was out the door and gone, and she heard him in the yard a moment later saying something to one of the hands with that same quick energy, and she turned back to the shelf reorganization and noted in the private accounting she kept of all things relevant to her situation that Nathan Hawthorne was not what she'd expected, and that this was worth paying attention to. The Friday trip to Blackridge was its own education. She rode into town with Hector Vega, who handled the supply wagon with the economy of motion of someone who has done something so many times that it has become invisible to him. Hector was not a talkative man, but his silence was comfortable rather than hostile, and somewhere on the road into town she understood that he had decided she was acceptable, and that this was how Hector Vega communicated acceptance. By not speaking, by simply continuing to be present without the quality of watchfulness that his silence has had when he was still assessing you. Blackridge in daylight was easier to read than Blackridge had been on her first evening. She could see it now as a working town rather than a threat. The Mercantile with its cluttered window, the two saloons on opposite ends of the main street like bookends on a shelf that didn't quite match, the hotel with its faded paint and its optimistic vacancy sign that probably had not needed to be taken down in some time. She could also see the way the town saw her. It was different from before. On her first evening, she'd been a stranger, an unknown quantity, a woman with a limp and a muddy bag asking for a room. Now she was a woman arriving with Hector Vega in Hawthorne Ridge's supply wagon, which was a form of introduction that meant something in a valley where Hawthorne Ridge meant something. The looks were still there, eyes going down and back up, the micro-calculations she'd been watching people perform her whole life. But there was a different quality to them now, less like a door deciding whether to open and more like a window deciding how far. Margaret Alcott was coming out of the dry goods store when they pulled up. Eliza had known this encounter was going to happen eventually. She had not known it would be this soon. Margaret Alcott looked at the wagon and at Hector and at Eliza, and her face did the thing that faces do when they have committed publicly to an opinion and then have to encounter the evidence that the opinion may not have been entirely correct. It was not a pleasant thing to watch. Eliza did not enjoy watching it. "Miss Whitmore," Margaret said. The name landed with a formality that was not courtesy. "Mrs. Alcott," Eliza said. A pause that both of them inhabited for a moment before Eliza stepped down from the wagon and moved toward the Mercantile, because she had a supply list and a limited amount of time, and Margaret Alcott's discomfort, however satisfying in the abstract, was not on that list. She heard Hector behind her, unhooking the wagon horse with deliberate indifference, and she felt something that was close to gratitude for the specific nature of his silence, the way it said, without saying anything, that he was there and that whatever happened next, she was not alone on this street the way she'd been on this street 2 weeks ago. Ed at the Mercantile was a different species from Margaret Alcott, a cautious man, not unkind, who asked practical questions and gave practical answers, and whose caution about Eliza seemed to be less personal than professional. The caution of a man who deals in transactions and likes to understand the terms before committing to them. She gave him her supply list, and he went through it item by item, noting what he had and what he'd need to order, and somewhere in this exchange she saw him recalibrate, saw the moment when he shifted from responding to a stranger with a list to responding to someone who understood what she was ordering and why. "Bulk cornmeal," he said, looking at her quantity. "That's a significant order. The current stores are partially compromised. I need to rebuild the buffer before hard winter. I can have the first half by Monday, second half the week after." "The first half Monday is fine. I'll send Hector." She looked at the list. "The dried beans, is that your current stock, or can you get more of the kidney variety? The navy beans are fine, but the kidney hold up better in long cook applications." He looked at her over the list. "I can get kidney, takes an extra week. Order what you can. I'll work with what arrives first." He nodded slowly, and she saw the window go a little further open. The real problem with Blackridge emerged not in the Mercantile but outside it, when she was waiting for Hector to finish loading and two women she didn't know came down the boardwalk. She heard her name before she saw their faces. heard it in the particular way names travel when they're the subject of a conversation that the speaker assumes is private. She caught fragments. Woman from the Hawthorne place. The leg. Caleb must have been desperate. Charity case. She kept her expression steady and her eyes on the wagon and her hands loose at her sides. The women passed without speaking to her directly, which was its own kind of statement. She watched them go and felt the familiar settling of something cold in her chest. Not surprise, never surprise. But the weight of a thing confirmed. This was how it was going to be, at least for a while. Maybe longer. Hector appeared at her elbow. "Ready," he said. "Yes," she said. They drove back to the ranch in the comfortable silence that was becoming their way of being together, and she spent the journey organizing the supply schedule in her head and not thinking about the two women on the boardwalk, or trying not to, with the partial success that trying not to think about something usually achieves. She did the work. That was what she had. She did the work, and she built the system, and she made the food better every week as she got the kitchen under proper control, and she watched the ranch hands' responses and adjusted accordingly, because people are data, and data is useful. By the end of the third week, she had a provisioning schedule that showed 6 months out. She had reduced daily waste by approximately a quarter. She had negotiated a better bulk price with Ed at the mercantile by consolidating the ranch's ordering into larger, less frequent purchases, which Ed had been receptive to because it meant he could plan his own stock better. She had fixed the flue damper on the wood stove herself, with a bent piece of wire and an afternoon of trial and error, because she'd asked about it twice and nothing had happened. She had also, inadvertently, become the person the ranch hands brought questions to. She hadn't sought this. It had happened the way things happen when you are visibly competent in a place that has been running without enough competence. People start directing their practical problems in your direction almost automatically, as if the brain, confronted with evidence of capability, simply routes toward it without asking for permission. Jim Cawley asked her about a persistent storage problem in the bunkhouse that had been creating moisture damage. She told him what she thought was causing it and what might fix it, and he fixed it, and the moisture damage stopped. Pete Calloway asked her what to do about a recurring problem with the saddle soap supply running out before the monthly Blackridge run. She adjusted the order schedule. Will, the youngest of the hands, asked her, with considerable awkwardness and several false starts, whether she could show him how to read the provisioning ledger because he wanted to understand where things were and how they tracked. She showed him. She sat at the kitchen table with Will on the opposite side and went through the ledger column by column, explaining the system, and watched his face while he followed it. The particular expression of someone who is learning something that is going to matter, who knows it is going to matter, who is filing it away with the specific attention of a person who has found a tool they needed without knowing they were looking. "This is how you kept the Pueblo Ranch from running short?" he asked. "It's how I kept track of the patterns," she said. "Once you know the patterns, you can see the problems coming far enough ahead to fix them." "Before Mr. Hawthorne even knows there's a problem," Will said. "That's the idea," she said. She looked up and found that Caleb was in the kitchen doorway. She didn't know how long he'd been there. He was watching the exchange with the expression she'd been learning to read. The one that was not quite neutral, but that required time to decode. He met her eyes when she looked up, and he didn't move from the doorway, just held her gaze for a moment in that direct way of his, and then he went on through the kitchen to wherever he was going. She went back to the ledger. "Did I get that right?" Will asked, looking at the column he'd just completed. She checked it. "Yes," she said. "You got it right?" The day the trouble between the brothers came through the kitchen wall clearly enough to be unavoidable started like any other. Cold, early, the stove needing attention before anything else could happen. It was the 5th week of her time at the ranch, and she had found a rhythm in the mornings, a sequence of tasks that took her from first light to breakfast, without much need for active decision-making, which she valued because the mornings were when her hip was worst, and her mind was clearest, and she preferred to spend her mental energy on the things that required it. She heard Caleb's voice first, flat, controlled, the voice of a man who is holding the lid on something. Then Nathan's. Higher in pitch, with that distinctive energy in it. The energy she'd observed was not recklessness exactly, or not only recklessness, but something underneath the recklessness that was looking for a direction and hadn't found it yet. She couldn't hear the specific words, not at first. The kitchen wall was thick, but the rhythm of it was clear, back and forth, neither giving ground, and the particular quality of tension that comes not from a new argument, but from an old one that has come around again and is finding the same grooves. Then Nathan's voice, louder. You treat this ranch like it's more important than the people on it. A silence. Then Caleb, quieter, and therefore more clearly through the wall. The ranch is what keeps the people on it fed and housed. That's not a small thing. I didn't say it was small. I said you make it more important than people. There's a difference. Another silence, different in quality from the first. I'm telling you the field needs... I know what the field needs, Nathan said. I've been working this land since I was 12. You don't have to tell me what the field needs. What I'm telling you is that Tom Haskins offered me a chance to work with the quarter horse operation in the spring. And you're telling me no without even... I'm not saying no. I'm saying not now. Not now is no with better manners, and you know it. Eliza stirred the pot on the stove and let them have it, because it was not hers to intervene in, and because she understood enough about the shape of it to know that intervening would not help. Nathan was chafing against something Caleb didn't know he was doing, and Caleb was holding on to something he didn't know he was holding, and that particular combination took longer than a kitchen conversation to resolve. What she didn't expect was Nathan coming into the kitchen 10 minutes later with the door still vibrating from the way he'd come through it. He stopped when he saw her. She kept stirring. You heard that, he said. The walls are thin, she said. He pulled out the chair he'd sat in on his first visit and dropped into it with the physical eloquence of a young man who is angry and has no immediate outlet for it. He put both forearms on the table. He looked at the surface of the table. He doesn't listen, Nathan said. He listens, she said. He just doesn't always agree. Same result? Not really, she said. She moved the pot off the direct heat. She turned and looked at him. What's the quarter horse operation? He told her. A man named Haskins, running a breeding and training outfit 3 counties east, looking for someone with land sense and a good eye for young horses. Nathan had met him at a stock sale in October. The offer was real, and the work was good, and it was the kind of thing Nathan was better suited for than general ranch labor, which she had observed herself without anyone having to tell her. You'd be good at it, she said. He looked up at her. Caleb thinks the ranch needs you here, she said. That's different from thinking you wouldn't be good at it. Nathan was quiet for a moment, which was itself remarkable, and meant he was actually thinking rather than just loading his next point. You're not going to tell me he's right, he said. I don't know if he's right, she said. I don't know enough about what the ranch needs to have an opinion on whether it needs you specifically versus someone else. What I know is that he's not saying no to hurt you. I know that, Nathan said, with the frustrated candor of someone who understands a thing perfectly well and is still angry about it. That's almost the problem. If he was doing it to hurt me, it would be easier to push back against. She let that sit. Outside, through the kitchen window, she could see Caleb crossing the yard toward the barn, moving with the particular purposefulness of a man who has ended a conversation by leaving it and is now finding something physical to do instead of continuing to feel whatever the conversation had made him feel. She had spent 5 weeks observing Caleb Hawthorne across the distance that existed between an employer and an employee, and what she had assembled in that time was a picture of a man who was considerably more complicated than the composure suggested. He worked harder than any man on the property and asked nothing of anyone that he didn't ask first of himself. He made decisions carefully and did not reverse them easily, but did reverse them when the evidence required it, which was rarer than it sounded. He had put up with more from Nathan's restlessness than most older brothers would have managed, not out of weakness, but out of a love he expressed almost entirely through accommodation and almost never through words. He also had not, in 5 weeks, said a single thing about her leg that was not purely practical. She had been waiting for it, the moment when the observation would arrive, in whatever form it came, the one that reminded her of the category she'd been placed in. It hadn't come. She'd watched for it carefully enough to be certain its absence was not an oversight. He's not trying to cage you, she said to Nathan. He's trying to hold on to something that keeps breaking away from him. That's not the same thing. Nathan looked at her with an expression that said she had landed somewhere he hadn't expected. "He told you that?" he said. "He hasn't told me much of anything personal," she said. "I'm observing." "You're very good at observing," Nathan said, not admiringly exactly, but with the specific tone of someone noting a quality that unnerves them slightly. "I've had to be," she said. "Sit down and eat something. You're angry, and you haven't eaten, and those two things together are worse than either one separately." He sat. He ate. He didn't stop being angry, but the anger became quieter and more manageable, which was the most that food could be reasonably expected to achieve. After he'd gone back out, she stood at the kitchen window and watched the yard for a moment, the hands moving across it on their various tasks. The horses at the fence of the near paddock, Caleb emerging from the barn with a tool she couldn't identify at this distance, moving with the deliberate efficiency that was his characteristic way of being in the world. She was thinking about what Nathan had said. "He's different with you." She did not let herself do much with that thought. She had learned, across 23 years of being useful without being wanted, to be careful with observations that could be read multiple ways, to take them in and hold them at a neutral distance until enough evidence accumulated to justify a conclusion. One observation was a data point. Data points required patterns before they became conclusions. She turned back to the kitchen. She had bread dough that needed attention, a lunch to prepare for 11 men, a supply order to finalize for Hector's Friday run, and a moisture problem in the corner of the storage room that she'd been meaning to trace to its source for 3 days. The work was there, same as always. The work was hers. She took it up again and kept moving, the way she always had, the way she intended to keep doing, and the morning went on around her, difficult and imperfect and real. The blizzard didn't arrive the way storms usually did, with warning, with that particular stillness that comes before bad weather, with animals moving to shelter, and the light going strange and yellow at the edges. This one came fast and mean off the northwest ridge, the kind of storm that the old ranch hands called a widowmaker, not because of poetry but because of history, because they had all known men who'd gone out into one and not come back. Nathan had been gone since mid-morning. Eliza knew this because she'd been in the kitchen when he left, had heard the argument between the two brothers through the wall that separated the kitchen from Caleb's small office, the voices rising and falling with the particular rhythm of men who had been having the same fight for years and had stopped believing it would ever resolve anything. She hadn't been able to make out every word, but she'd caught enough. Nathan had spotted a bay stallion running loose on the upper north pasture, a beautiful animal that had apparently drifted down from somewhere higher up, and he wanted to go after it. Caleb had said the weather was wrong. Nathan had said Caleb always thought the weather was wrong. The timing was wrong. The risk was too high. Everything was always too much for his older brother, who had turned caution into a religion and responsibility into a cage. The door had slammed hard enough to rattle the lamp on the kitchen shelf. By noon, the temperature had dropped 12 degrees, and the sky was the color of a bruise pressed flat. By 2 in the afternoon, the first real snow was coming down in sheets, and by 3, when Hector Vega, the senior ranch hand, a lean, quiet man of about 50 who had been at Hawthorne Ridge longer than anyone except Caleb himself, came to find Eliza in the kitchen, the visibility outside had dropped to less than 30 feet. "He's not back," Hector said. He didn't say who. He didn't need to. Eliza set down the pot she was holding. "How long?" "Going on 6 hours. He took the Bay Trail north. That trail cuts through the gorge about 4 miles up, and in this kind of snow—" He stopped. Hector was not a man who finished sentences that ended badly if he could avoid it. "Where's Caleb?" "Saddling up." She was already moving. She found Caleb in the barn, working with the focused grimness of a man who has made a decision and is not interested in discussing it. He had his big roan out and was cinching the saddle with the efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times. And when she came in through the barn door, he looked at her once and went back to what he was doing. "You're not going alone," she said. "I'm not taking anyone else into that. I'm not asking to go with you. I'm asking you to wait 10 minutes. He stopped and looked at her. "Eliza, 10 minutes, she said. "The tack room. There are ranch maps in there. I've seen them. Give me 10 minutes before you ride out blind." She could see him calculating, the time lost against whatever the maps could offer. And she held his gaze and didn't look away, because she understood that this was one of those moments where the looking away would cost her everything. 8 minutes, he said. The tack room off the back of the barn was cold and smelled of leather and oil and old hay. The maps were rolled and stacked in a wooden crate that had been shoved under the workbench, and Eliza pulled them out one by one until she found the survey map of the North Valley, a large, detailed thing, hand-drawn and annotated in at least 3 different people's handwriting over what looked like several decades. She spread it on the workbench and weighted the corners with whatever came to hand. Caleb was behind her. She could hear him breathing. "Show me where the Bay Trail goes," she said. He leaned over the map and traced a route with one finger, north from the ranch yard, up through the lower meadows, into a narrow gorge cut by a seasonal creek, then a switchback that climbed to a high shelf pasture where horses sometimes drifted in summer. "He'd have followed the stallion up the gorge," Caleb said. "The gorge is sheltered for the first mile, but when you come out on the shelf—" He stopped again. Same as Hector. Eliza studied the map. She had been studying it for 5 days, actually, since she'd found the crate and recognized that understanding the geography of the ranch was part of understanding how to provision it properly, how to plan for winter resupply, which routes stayed passable and which didn't. She knew the map better than anyone had realized, including herself until this moment. "There's a secondary trail," she said, pointing. "Here. It branches off the main route about a mile before the gorge and curves around the east face of this ridge. It comes out at the top of the shelf from the other side. That trail's been closed for 4 years. Rockslide took out the middle section." "Partially," she said. "Look at the notation here. This says partial obstruction. It doesn't say impassable." She looked up at him. "If Nathan got into trouble on the main gorge route, and you go in after him from the south, you're both in the gorge in a blizzard. But if you go around the east face, I come out above him. You come out above the shelf, and you can see down into the gorge exit. If he made it through, he'd be sheltering on the shelf. If he didn't make it through—" She kept her voice even. "You'd be able to see where he stopped." Caleb was quiet for a moment. His hand was still on the map, his index finger resting on the east trail she'd pointed to. She could see the muscle in his jaw working. "The rockslide section," he said. "It's on the lower part of the east face. If the obstruction's a few boulders and scrub, a horse could pick through it. If it's worse than that, you'd know within half a mile, and you could come back to the main route." She paused. "It's a reconnaissance, not a commitment." He looked at her. "When did you learn to think like that?" he said. "I've had a lot of time to learn things I wasn't supposed to need," she said, and she meant it without any bitterness, or tried to. She folded the corner of the map down to the relevant section and handed it to him. "Take this." He took it. He was already moving, already back in the barn's main aisle, and she followed him out and stood at the barn door while he mounted up and the roan moved forward into the gray-white wall of the storm, and within 20 feet she couldn't see either of them anymore. She stood there for a moment longer than she probably should have. Then she went back inside. What followed was the longest afternoon of Eliza Whitmore's life, and she had lived through some long afternoons. She organized it the way she organized everything when things were bad. She found the tasks that needed doing, and she did them, one at a time, not looking too far ahead. She stoked every fire in the main house. She put a large pot of broth on to simmer, because when men came in from cold like this, they needed heat from the inside first. She inventoried the medical supplies she could find: clean cloth, a bottle of carbolic, laudanum in a small brown bottle, needle and thread, a wooden splint that had been fashioned and never used. She laid everything on the kitchen table where she could reach it quickly. Hector came in twice. The first time he said nothing, just looked at what she'd laid out on the table and nodded once. The second time he said, "He took the east trail." "I know. Never heard of anyone going up the east face in winter. It was either that or go blind into the gorge." Hector was quiet for a moment. "You told him to go that way?" "I showed him the option. He made the decision." Hector looked at her, the same kind of look she'd been getting from the ranch hands for about 2 weeks now, the one she couldn't quite interpret but that felt different from the look she'd gotten in Black Ridge, less like an assessment and more like a recalibration. "The other boys are getting anxious," he said. "Pete wants to go out." "Tell Pete to stay in," she said. "1 man in that storm we can manage. 3 men in that storm is a different problem." "He's not going to want to hear that from me." "Then I'll tell him," she said, and she did. Went to the bunkhouse, which was its own small drama, because ranch hands in 1876 Colorado did not typically take instruction from a woman with a limp who'd been on the property less than 3 weeks. Pete Calloway was 24 and scared for his friend and not particularly interested in being managed. He said so. At some volume. Eliza let him finish. "I understand you want to help," she said. "I'd want to help too. But Caleb went around the east face specifically so we'd have someone on the main route available if he needs assistance coming back. If you go out now, you take that option off the table." She paused. "And you know this valley better than I do. How long before you can't navigate at all in this kind of snow?" Pete looked at the window. The glass was almost white with it. "Hour," he said. "Quieter now. Maybe less. Then stay ready. At the first sign of let-up, you go. But right now, staying here is the useful thing." He didn't say he agreed. He sat down on his bunk and stared at the floor, which was as close to agreement as she was going to get. She went back to the house. The light outside was failing, she said, not just from the storm, but from actual dusk arriving underneath it, so that by 5 o'clock the world outside the windows was a uniform dark gray, and the sound of the wind in the roof had settled into a constant low moan that was not quite sound anymore, just a vibration you felt behind your sternum. Eliza sat at the kitchen table with her ledger open in front of her and wrote nothing in it. Her hip ached. Her knee, which she'd cleaned and dressed properly after arriving at the ranch 3 weeks ago, had stiffened in the cold, and she'd been favoring it all day without realizing it until Hector's wife, a small, dark-haired woman named Clara, who helped with the house 2 days a week and had stayed when the storm came, touched her arm and said quietly, "Sit. Let it rest." "I'm fine." "You've been standing for 4 hours," Clara said. "Sit." Eliza sat. Clara put a cup of coffee in front of her without asking and sat down across the table, and neither of them said anything for a while, which was the kind of silence that only exists between people who are both waiting for the same thing. "You think he found him?" Clara said eventually. "I think Caleb Hawthorne has been navigating that valley since he was 16 years old," Eliza said. "I think if anyone can find Nathan in this, it's him." "That's not what I asked." Eliza looked at her coffee. "I don't know," she said, and that was honest, and saying it out loud cost her something she hadn't known she was holding. At 6:30, the wind dropped. Not all the way. It kept blowing, kept pushing snow across the windows. But the deeper moan went out of it, and the particular quality of pressure against the walls changed in a way that all of them felt simultaneously, that collective shift of people who have been braced against something suddenly feeling the force of it lessen. Eliza was at the door before she'd made a conscious decision to move. She heard the horse first, then a second sound she couldn't identify, a scraping, something irregular, and then Hector's voice from somewhere in the yard, and then more voices, and she went out without her coat because there wasn't time for the coat. Caleb came out of the dark, and the snow like something assembled from it, the roan stumbling in the yard. And across the saddle in front of him was Nathan, not sitting up, not helping, folded over the pommel with Caleb's arm across his back holding him in place. Nathan was conscious, barely, his face gray-white against the snow and his right leg at an angle that told Eliza everything she needed to know before she reached them. "Front room," she said. "Get him in." "His leg! I can see his leg. Get him inside." What happened in the next 40 minutes was not orderly. It never was. The ranch hands crowded around and got in each other's way, and Nathan made sounds that Eliza refused to let herself hear as anything other than information. The pain was there. The leg was bad. But he was responsive, and his color was returning in the heat of the front room, and his breathing was strong. She worked with everything she'd laid out on the kitchen table, directing Hector and Clara and one of the younger hands named Will, who turned out to be steadier under pressure than anyone expected, including himself. She cleaned the wound on Nathan's calf where the bone had shifted against the skin, but not broken through. That, at least, was something. "A clean break," Hector said, looking at the angle, and a man who had worked cattle and horses as long as Hector had seen enough broken bones to have an opinion worth considering. She got the splint on with Will holding the leg straight and Nathan gripping the arm of the chair hard enough that his knuckles went white, and she tied it off and gave him the laudanum and told him not to move. "Eliza," Nathan said, through teeth that were still chattering. "Drink that," she said. "Drink it first, then talk." He drank it. He talked anyway because Nathan Hawthorne had never in his life prioritized anything over whatever he wanted to say in that moment, which was part of his problem, and also, she was beginning to understand, part of what made him genuinely difficult to dislike. He wouldn't have found me, Nathan said, without the East Trail. I made it through this gorge, but I couldn't get back down. The snow came in too fast, and Pepper. This was apparently the horse, a name she hadn't known. Pepper put her foot wrong on the shelf and went down. I thought... He stopped. Something moved across his face. I thought I was staying up there. Eliza was checking the splint ties. She didn't say anything. The East Trail comes out right above where I was, he said. Right there, like someone planned it. He looked at her. His eyes were dilated from cold and pain and the laudanum beginning to work, but they were clear enough for the look to mean something. He told me you sent him that way. I showed him a map, she said. Same thing. It's not the same thing. Eliza. He said her name with a weight to it that made her stop and look at him. He was 20 years old and reckless, and had caused no small amount of trouble in the 3 weeks she'd been here, and right now he looked like what he actually was, a young man who had genuinely believed, up there on that shelf in the dark and the snow, that he was not going to survive the night. Thank you, he said. She didn't know what to do with it. She tied off the last knot on the splint and stood up and said, "Sleep," which was not a response to what he'd said, but was the most useful thing she could offer. She found Caleb outside. He was at the well, drawing water, and she understood after a moment that this was not because he needed water. It was because he needed something to do with his hands, something physical and ordinary after whatever the last 4 hours had been. He heard her behind him and didn't turn around. She waited. He told me I got the timing wrong, Caleb said. His voice was flat in the way voices go flat when there's too much underneath to let any of it out safely. This morning, when he left, he said, I always think the timing's wrong, the risk's too high, everything's always a reason not to move. He turned the crank on the well. He's not entirely wrong about that. He's wrong about tonight, Eliza said. Tonight, yes. And most other times, probably. Caleb set the bucket down and turned around and looked at her. He looked like a man who had been afraid for a long time in the last few hours, and was only now beginning to let the body acknowledge it. There was nothing smooth about his face right now, nothing of the careful composure she'd seen him maintain in the 3 weeks she'd been here. He looked tired and cold, and like a man who had ridden blind into a blizzard because the alternative was unthinkable. Your coat, he said. I forgot it. You're going to freeze. I've been frozen before. He looked at her for another moment, then shrugged off his own coat and held it out. She started to say she didn't need it, but she was in fact extremely cold, having been outside without a coat in a Colorado January for going on 10 minutes. And so she took it and put it on and stood there in a coat that was about twice her size and smelled of horses and cold air and the specific kind of exhaustion that comes from doing something very hard and coming out the other side of it. The East Trail, he said. It worked. It might not have. No, she agreed. It might not have. He picked up the bucket. He put it down again. He was looking at the barn. He said you planned it, Caleb said. I read the map. 3 weeks on the property and you read the map well enough to... He stopped. There was something in his voice she hadn't heard before, and she couldn't name it precisely, but it had weight to it. Nobody on this ranch has looked at those survey maps in 4 years. I forgot they were in the tack room. I look at everything, Eliza said. I always have. It's how I know where I fit. Caleb turned and looked at her. She hadn't meant to say that last part. It had come out because she was cold and tired, and the last 4 hours had taken something from her the same way they'd taken something from everyone else. The sustained tension of waiting when there was nothing else to do but wait. She held his gaze and didn't try to walk it back. I'm sorry about this morning, he said. In town. What Margaret Alcott, you weren't there this morning. I heard about it. Then you heard what happened, and I don't need to talk about it again. He was quiet. Then, she had no right. No, Eliza said. She didn't. But she wasn't the first, and she won't be the last. And what I need from you is not anger on my behalf. What I need from you is to keep the position, pay me what you said you'd pay me, and treat me the same as anyone else who does the work." He looked at her for a long time in the dark and the wind. "You do more than anyone else who does the work," he said. "That's my business," she said. "Just keep to what I asked." She went back inside before he could say anything else, and the cold followed her through the door, and she stood in the kitchen for a moment with his coat still around her shoulders and the fire going in the stove and the sound of Nathan's breathing carrying from the front room, slow and even now, the laudanum doing its work. She had not realized until this moment how tightly wound she'd been all afternoon. The releasing of it was not comfortable. It never was. It felt like putting a limb that had gone numb back in the blood's way. That particular returning feeling that is close enough to pain that the body can't always tell the difference. Clara appeared in the kitchen doorway. She looked at Eliza and then at the coat, and then back at Eliza. "Broth's ready," Clara said. "Good," Eliza said. "Let's start with the boy first." She shrugged out of Caleb's coat and hung it on the hook by the door and went back to work, because the work was still there and it was still hers. And that, at the end of this particular day, was something she knew how to hold on to. The ranch hands came in from the bunkhouse in twos and threes as the storm continued to ease, stamping snow off their boots and speaking in the subdued tones of men who have collectively been frightened and are not quite sure what to do with the feeling. Pete Calloway sat down across from Will and said nothing for 10 minutes, and then said, "He's really all right?" And Will said, "Legs broke, but he's all right." And Pete put his elbows on the table and pressed his face into his hands for a moment, and then straightened up and asked for broth. Eliza served it. She moved around the table, filling cups and checking the pot, and not looking at anyone in particular and not expecting to be looked at. And so she almost missed the moment when the conversations around the table shifted, not in subject, but in direction. The ranch hands had been talking to each other, and then they were talking to her, not at her, not around her, to her. Hector said something about the East Trail, something technical about the rock slide condition, and looked at her for confirmation. She confirmed. Will asked how she'd known to have the medical supplies ready before Caleb came back, and she explained the logic of it. That preparation is not prophecy, it's probability, and you prepare for the most likely bad outcomes and hope you've misjudged. Pete Calloway, who had argued with her 3 hours ago in the bunkhouse, said quietly to his cup, "Smart thinking, getting us to stay put." She didn't make anything of it. She just nodded and moved on. But she felt it. That shift in the room, the particular quality of being seen by people who had looked at her for 3 weeks and seen only the leg or the limp or the question of whether she could really manage, and were now, because of one long cold afternoon and a decision made over a survey map in a tack room, looking at something else. Not a cripple, not a charity case, not a woman who needed allowances made. Someone who had held them together when things came apart. She carried that feeling carefully. The way you carry something you're not sure how to trust yet, something new enough that you don't know yet if it will hold weight. But she carried it. Later, when the house was quieter and the storm had dropped to a steady snow, and Nathan was sleeping deeply in the front room and the ranch hands had gone back to the bunkhouse, Eliza sat at the kitchen table with her ledger and wrote the supply notes she'd been putting off all day. The lamp was low. Her hip ached with the steady, deep ache she'd lived alongside her whole life. The coat was still on the hook by the door. She heard Caleb's boots in the hall, and then the boots stopped outside the kitchen, and she knew he was there without looking up. "He's sleeping well," she said. "I know. I checked." She wrote the last figure in the column and closed the ledger. She heard him come into the kitchen and sit down at the table across from her. She looked up. He looked better than he had at the well. Still tired, still worn down to something basic and real, but the acute fear had gone out of his face and left something she'd been seeing glimpses of for weeks. The actual man underneath the management and the composure and the responsibility he wore like a second coat. He put something on the table between them. She looked at it. It was a small book, not new, the cover worn at the corners, and she recognized it after a moment as a volume of poetry she had mentioned, in passing, in her first week at the ranch. She had said something about having read it years ago and missing it, and she had not thought he was listening. He He said nothing about it. He didn't explain or make a speech. She picked it up. She set it down again and looked at him. "Caleb," she said, "you don't have to say anything about it." "I know I don't," she said. "I'm going to anyway." She thought for a moment about what the honest thing was, the direct thing, the thing she would have said before years of learning to make herself small enough to fit in spaces where she wasn't truly wanted. "Nobody's remembered something I said before," she said. "Not like that. Not as if it mattered." He held her gaze. He was not a man who looked away from things, which she'd noticed early on and had come to understand as one of his real qualities. Not a pose, not a performance, just the natural disposition of a man who believed that looking at things honestly was the only way to know what they actually were. "Things you say matter," he said. She picked up the book and held it and didn't have anything else she trusted herself to say. Not tonight, not after the kind of day today had been. And he seemed to understand that because he didn't push for more. He stood up and said goodnight, and she said goodnight, and he went down the hall to check on Nathan one more time. She sat alone in the kitchen with the lamp and the ledger and the small, worn book of poems and the sound of the wind finishing what the storm had been, the last of it working its way through the eaves above the window. Outside, the snow was still falling, but the worst of it had passed. Nathan's leg healed the way broken things do when the person attached to them is young and stubborn and constitutionally incapable of staying still, faster than it should have, slower than he wanted, and with considerably more argument than was strictly necessary. He spent the first week in the front room on a cot that Eliza had arranged close enough to the fire to keep him warm and far enough from the door that he couldn't easily get up and do something inadvisable. He complained about this arrangement on day 2. She ignored him. He complained again on day 3 with more creativity. She adjusted the laudanum schedule and told him to sleep. By day 4, he had recruited Will into bringing him cards, and the two of them played for matchsticks through the afternoon while Eliza worked around them. And she found she didn't mind the noise of it, the low talk, the occasional bark of laughter, the sound of a young man remembering that he was alive and finding it worth celebrating. Caleb came in each evening after the day's work was done and sat with his brother for a while, and these conversations were different from the ones she'd heard through the wall before the storm. Quieter, less shaped like arguments waiting to happen. She did not eavesdrop intentionally, but the house was not large and she caught fragments. Nathan asking questions about the ranch that had the genuine quality of curiosity rather than the combative quality of someone looking for ammunition. Caleb answering with more patience than she'd heard him use with his brother before. Whatever had happened up on that shelf in the dark, whatever Nathan had thought about in the hours before Caleb found him, it had shifted something between them. And the shift was fragile in the way new things are fragile, but it was real. The town of Blackridge began to hear about it within a week. Eliza had not thought much about how word traveled in a place like this. She'd been too focused on the work of the ranch, the provisioning, the daily business of feeding and managing, but she understood it intellectually. Small, isolated communities in winter have limited entertainment and news travels the way water travels, finding every crack. The story of the blizzard and the rescue and the East Trail spread through Blackridge and the surrounding ranches in pieces, each piece slightly altered in the retelling, until what came back to the ranch was a version of events that bore a recognizable relationship to what had actually happened, but had been improved in the direction of drama in several places. What remained consistent in every version was this. The woman at Hawthorne Ridge had read the maps and sent Caleb up the east face, and Nathan was alive because of it. Eliza learned this not from Caleb but from Clara, who came to the ranch on a Tuesday and mentioned it with the careful neutrality of someone delivering information they know will land with weight. "Margaret Alcott's telling people you got lucky," Clara said. Eliza was rolling dough. She kept rolling. "She's not entirely wrong. She's also telling people Caleb should have sent you on your way after the first week. She's more wrong about that." Clara watched her work. "You don't care what people in town say?" Eliza considered this honestly. "I care," she said. "I'd be lying if I said I didn't care. But caring about it and letting it change what I do are different things." Clara nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she'd been working out on her own. "Owen Pratt came into the Mercantile yesterday," she said, and her voice had changed slightly. A careful quality to it now. He was asking about the ranch, asking about Caleb's arrangements, whether there was a woman living on the property. Eliza stopped rolling. Owen Pratt was a name she'd heard mentioned twice since arriving in Blackridge, once from Hector, once from Caleb himself in passing, in the context of water rights and a disputed boundary on the northeast pasture. Hector had used the word careful when he talked about Pratt, with the specific emphasis men use when they mean dangerous. Caleb had said nothing directly but had mentioned the name with a flatness that told her everything she needed to know about how he felt. "What did the mercantile owner tell him?" Eliza asked. "Ed doesn't gossip," Clara said. "He said he didn't know much about Caleb's arrangements, and that was the end of it." Eliza went back to the dough, but her mind had moved to a different place. Owen Pratt owned the Pratt Holdings on the south side of the valley, a spread nearly as large as Hawthorne Ridge, with the critical difference that Pratt's water access depended on an easement that crossed Caleb's land. This was information she had assembled slowly, from fragments of conversation and the ranch ledgers she managed, because understanding the ranch's vulnerabilities was part of understanding how to do her job properly. She knew that the easement agreement was old and had never been formally documented beyond a handshake between Pratt's father and Caleb's father in the late 1860s. She knew that Caleb considered the arrangement settled. She suspected, from the way Hector spoke about Pratt with that particular careful emphasis, that Pratt did not consider it settled at all. She filed this away and said nothing about it to anyone, because she had not been asked, and because she had not yet put enough of the pieces together to say anything useful. Caleb was not a man who courted easily, or obviously, or in any way that announced itself. He was also not a man who did things without intention, and so Eliza understood that the book of poetry had been intentional, and the small workspace he'd cleared for her in the corner of the front room, a proper desk, pulled from storage, with a lamp positioned where the light was best, had been intentional, and the way he'd started asking her opinion on decisions that were technically not within her purview, but that she clearly had views about, was also intentional. She did not know what to do with any of this, not because she didn't understand what it meant. She understood exactly what it meant, but understanding a thing and knowing how to hold it without flinching were different skills. And the second one she had never had much opportunity to practice. She had spent so many years in the particular position of someone who is useful but not wanted, useful to her cousin Helen, useful to the household in Pueblo, useful in the abstract sense of being a capable person who could be deployed and thanked and not thought about too deeply. That the possibility of being wanted for something beyond her usefulness was something she approached the way she approached the icy sections of road in winter, with her weight shifted carefully and her attention on the ground beneath her feet. The moment that broke through her defenses came not from Caleb but from Pete Calloway, which she had not expected. It was a Saturday, 3 weeks after the storm, and the ranch hands were in the yard after the midday meal, and there was a wagon coming up the road from Blackridge, a ranch supply wagon, the driver a man named Coffee, who made deliveries to several of the valley spreads. On this particular trip, Coffee had brought a woman with him, the wife of one of the smaller ranch operators to the south, a woman named Grace Tillman, who had never visited Hawthorne Ridge before and was clearly satisfying a curiosity she'd been building for some weeks. Grace Tillman was a friendly woman, not malicious, and her curiosity about Eliza had the quality of genuine interest rather than hostility. But she was standing in the yard with 3 of the ranch hands when she said it out loud, in the particular tone of someone who is stating what she considers to be an obvious and compassionate truth, that it was remarkable, really, what Caleb Hawthorne had done, taking on a woman with a disability, such a Christian act of charity. There was a pause in the yard, and Pete Calloway, 24 years old, not a man known for either sensitivity or social grace, Pete, who had argued with Eliza in the bunkhouse and told his cup she was smart 3 weeks later. Pete said, flat and without particular heat, "She's not charity, ma'am. She runs this place." Grace Tillman blinked. "The maps," Will added, from where he was leaning against the fence. "She knew the maps. We wouldn't have Nathan back without her." Eliza was standing in the doorway of the ranch house. She had heard all of it. She stood very still and made sure her face was composed and did not reveal what was happening underneath it, which was something close to the feeling of a held breath releasing after a very long time. Grace Tillman recovered and pivoted gracefully to asking Eliza about the kitchen arrangements, and the moment moved on, but it didn't leave. It stayed with Eliza through the afternoon and into the evening, turning over in the specific way that things turn over when they are rewriting something you thought you already knew. She was in the front room working at her desk, the desk Caleb had pulled from storage, when she heard him come in and stop. "You heard what Pete said," Caleb said. It was not a question. "I was in the doorway," she said. He came and sat in the chair near the fire, the one Nathan had occupied for his recovery, and that was now reverting to its original function as the place Caleb sat when he had something on his mind. "Grace Tillman means well," he said. "I know she does." "It doesn't make it easier to hear." "No," Eliza said. "It doesn't." She set down her pen. She turned in her chair so she was facing him properly. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "When you stopped on the road, in the sleet, when you saw me walking." She had thought about this moment many times since January, turning it over, trying to understand it from every angle. "What did you see?" He was quiet for a moment. He did not look away from her. "Someone walking 8 miles in a January rainstorm to make a case for herself," he said. "That was the first thing. The second thing," he paused. "The second thing was that you didn't ask me to help you up from the road. You were already getting up." She held that. "Most people would have offered a hand," she said. "I'm not most people," he said. "And I didn't think you wanted a hand. I thought you wanted the position." "I did." "I know." He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and she saw something in his posture that she'd come to recognize over the weeks. The slight unbending that happened when he was about to say something he'd been keeping back. "Eliza, I want to say something, and I want you to let me finish before you argue with it." "I don't always argue." "You argue every time I say something you're not sure how to accept," he said, and this was so precisely accurate that she felt it land somewhere behind her sternum. She nodded. "All right." He looked at his hands, then at her. "What Margaret Alcott did on that boardwalk," he said. "What every person did who looked at your leg and decided that was what you were. That cost you things. I understand that. I'm not pretending I know exactly what it cost you, because I don't. But I can see the shape of it." He paused. "I can see the way you brace every time someone's going to look at you, the way you get answers out before questions come. Because if you can establish what you can do fast enough, maybe they won't get to the part where they decide you can't do it." He paused again, longer. "That's not a way to live, Eliza. That's a way to survive." She was very still. "I've been surviving since I was 6 years old," she said. "I know. I can see that too." His voice was not soft. It was not the kind of softness that comes from pity, which she would have known how to refuse, but it had a directness in it that meant something different. "You don't have to survive here. You can just live here, work here, be here." He stopped. "That's all I'm saying." She looked at him for a long moment. "That's not all you're saying," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's not, but I thought I'd start with the part you might actually believe." She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was in the family of one. He watched her, and there was something in his face that she let herself look at directly for the first time. Not analyzing it, not categorizing it, not trying to figure out what to do with it, just looking at it. "The injury never made you less," he said. "I need you to understand that's not something I'm telling you to make you feel better. It's something I observed, starting from a road outside Blackridge on a January evening." She thought about what she'd said to him weeks ago, that night in the kitchen with his coat still on her shoulders. "Nobody's remembered something I said before. Not like that. Not as if it mattered." She thought about being 6 years old and learning to get answers out fast before the questions came. She thought about Margaret Alcott's face and her traveling bag in the mud, and every face before that, and every closed door, and what all of it together had built inside her. Not a wound exactly, or not only that, also a kind of architecture, a structure she'd built to live in when there was nowhere else. She didn't say any of this. She said, "You're not easy to know, Caleb Hawthorne." "No," he said. "I've been told. You don't let people in." "I let you into my tack room," he said, with complete seriousness, and she looked at him, and he looked back, and she laughed. A real one, not the half laugh from before, a genuine one that surprised her. And something in his face shifted into what she was now certain was as close to a smile as this particular man's face was going to produce without medical intervention. "The tack room," she said. "Of course. The maps were in there. I know the maps were in there. And you used them. Caleb?" And Nathan came home. She shook her head. She was still smiling, which was not a thing she'd done often in this room, in this house, in this valley, and which she became aware of as she was doing it with the particular awareness of someone who doesn't want to stop. He stood up, which was typical. He had a way of ending conversations at the moment they'd reached something real, not to escape the realness, but because he seemed to believe that real things didn't need to be pressed further, that they could just be left where they'd landed and trusted to hold. "There's something I should tell you," she said, before he could go. He stopped. She told him about Owen Pratt and what Clara had said, and the water easement, and what she'd put together from the ledgers and the fragments of conversation. She told it plainly and in sequence, the way she always told things when they mattered, because she'd found over the years that the way you delivered information shaped how much of it people could actually hear, and she wanted him to hear all of it. He listened without interrupting, which was something she valued in him. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How long have you known about the easement?" he asked. 3 weeks. I found the original supply agreement from 1869 in the back of the ledger. It references a water access arrangement and says details to be confirmed in a separate document. I couldn't find the separate document. "Because it doesn't exist," Caleb said. "I know. That's what concerns me." He looked at her. "You went through the whole ledger archive." "I went through everything in the storage room. I told you the first night I needed to take inventory." "I thought you meant the kitchen." "I meant everything," she said. "I always mean everything." He stood with his hand on the doorframe, and his face in the particular configuration she'd come to understand meant he was working something through that had more dimensions than it looked like from the outside. "Pratt's been quiet since October," he said, "since before you arrived." "Quiet isn't the same as settled," she said, "and if he's asking in town about your arrangements, about whether there's a woman on the property—" "He's looking for something to use," Caleb said, "or looking to understand whether anything's changed, whether you're in a different position than you were." He was quiet again. "I can go back through the correspondence files," Eliza said. "If there's anything in writing between your father and Pratt's father, any letter, any receipt, anything that references the water arrangement, it would be in there." "That's years of correspondence." "I know." He looked at her. "Eliza." "It's my job," she said. "Let me do it." He left. She turned back to her desk and pulled a clean sheet of paper and began making notes on what she remembered from the ledger pages, building a timeline, the way she always built things, from the bottom, piece by piece, until you could see what shape it was going to be. The correspondence files were in 3 wooden boxes in the same storage room where she'd found the survey maps, and she began working through them the following morning before the ranch hands were up, in the pre-dawn quiet that was her favorite time of the day, the house still and cold, and the lamp casting its circle of light, and everything else dark enough to be theoretical. She found the first letter from Pratt's father on the 3rd day, then a second, then a third. Then, tucked behind an unrelated bill of sale from 1871, a single folded page in a different handwriting, older, careful, the kind of handwriting that people used when they understood that what they were writing down was going to matter. She read it twice. Then she sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk and thought about what this changed. She brought it to Caleb after supper when the house was quiet. Nathan was up and mobile now, walking with a crutch that he used with considerable theatrical suffering, and he was in the front room when she came in and set the paper on Caleb's desk. Caleb read it. Nathan, from across the room, said, "What is it?" "Quiet," Caleb said. "I'm just—" "Nathan, quiet." Nathan went quiet, which was remarkable enough that Eliza made a private note of it. Caleb looked up from the paper. "This is," he said, and stopped. "It's a formal statement of the easement terms," Eliza said, "dated 1868, signed by your father and by Franklin Pratt, witnessed by the Blackridge County Recorder. It specifies the easement as a right of access in perpetuity, contingent on the Pratt family maintaining the access road in acceptable condition, defined in the document as passable by wagon through all but extreme weather. She paused. The access road has not been maintained. I checked the ranch records. Your father noted it in 1873 and again in 1875. Owen Pratt has been using the easement without meeting its conditions for at least 3 years. Caleb looked at the paper again. He doesn't know this exists, he said. He may suspect there's something in writing somewhere, Eliza said. But if he knew this specific document existed, he wouldn't be asking around town about your arrangements. He'd be doing something else. Nathan said from the front room, "What's happening?" And this time Caleb answered him. He explained it. The easement, the conditions, the access road, what the document meant legally and practically. Nathan listened with an attention that Eliza had not seen him give to anything before, the kind of attention that comes when something penetrates through all the noise a person uses to keep the world at a comfortable distance. So Pratt's been using something he hasn't earned, Nathan said. For 3 years, Caleb said, and he was going to... Nathan stopped. Thought, what was he going to do? I don't know yet, Caleb said, but a man who asks questions about his neighbor's household arrangements is a man who's looking for leverage. He looked at Eliza. If he'd found it before we found this... He didn't, Eliza said. That's what matters now. What happened in the following days was quieter than it had any right to be, which Eliza suspected was exactly how it needed to go. Caleb made a trip to Blackridge to speak with the county recorder, who confirmed the document was legitimate and had a corresponding entry in the county ledger that had never been cross-referenced with the Pratt easement file because nobody had thought to cross-reference it. A lawyer in Denver, reached by telegraph, confirmed that the conditions clause was enforceable. Caleb sent Owen Pratt a letter. Formal. Brief. Courteous in the particular way that legal certainty makes courtesy effortless. It outlined the easement conditions, documented 3 years of noncompliance, and gave Pratt 60 days to restore the access road to the standard specified in the 1868 agreement. He did not threaten. He did not posture. He simply presented what was true and let it do its own work. Pratt sent a reply in 4 days, also formal, also brief, conspicuously absent of the leverage he'd apparently been planning to develop. Hector read the reply over Caleb's shoulder and said, "That's a man who knows he's been outflanked." "He has been outflanked," Caleb said. Hector looked at Eliza, who was at her desk and pretending to work on the provisioning ledger. "By the woman who went through 30 years of correspondence boxes before sunrise," Hector said. "I needed something to do in the mornings," Eliza said. She heard Hector laugh, which was not a thing that happened every day. The following Sunday, Caleb asked her to ride with him. Not to check fences, not on ranch business, just to ride, up the North Valley Road on a clear, cold morning with the mountains white above them and the sky the kind of blue that only exists at altitude. She had learned to ride better in the past weeks, her body adapting to the saddle in the way bodies adapt when they are given something they need. Not perfectly, not without the leg making its feelings known, but well enough. They rode to the high meadow at the north end of the property, the one she'd seen on the map but never in person, and stopped where the land opened out and you could see the valley below and the mountains on 3 sides. It was the kind of view that makes you feel small in a way that is not diminishing but clarifying, as if the scale of things is useful information. They were quiet for a while. "Nathan wants to go to Montana," Caleb said. She looked at him. "When?" "Spring," he says. "There's a horse operation up there, a man he met last fall before you arrived, who offered him a position working with young horses. Nathan's good with horses. Better than he is with cattle." A pause. "Better than he is with me, maybe." "You'll let him go," she said. It was not a question. "I think I have to," Caleb said. "I've been thinking about it since the storm. He said I turn everything into a reason not to move, and..." He stopped. "He's not wrong. I hold on to things. People. The way things have been." He looked at the mountains. "Holding on to Nathan has been costing him something. Maybe costing me something too." "Letting him go isn't the same as giving up on him," Eliza said. "I know that. I'm still working on believing it." She looked at the valley below them, the ranch yard small and orderly at this distance. The road she'd walked in January, a thin line through the white meadow. the mountains she'd never seen until this winter. It was remarkable, the way a place could become yours without you noticing, the way belonging could happen quietly, in the margins of work and cold mornings and a book left on a table. "What you said," she said, "in the front room, that I could just live here instead of survive here." He looked at her. "I've been trying," she said. "It's harder than it sounds." "I know. You'd think after all this time She stopped, started again. "You'd think knowing your own worth would get easier." "It gets different," he said. "I'm not sure it gets easier." She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the distance between them on horseback was small, and neither of them moved to close it, and neither of them moved to increase it. "I'm not leaving in spring," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not leaving," she said again, more carefully, because she needed to be exact about what she was saying. He held her gaze with the same steadiness he brought to everything, that direct, considered, refusing to look away quality that had unnerved her the first week, and that she now understood was simply who he was, how he moved through the world, his fundamental way of taking things seriously. "I know that too," he said. The wind came across the meadow, and she turned her face into it and let it be cold and let it be real, let the mountains be where they were and the ranch below them be what it was, and let herself, for one long clear moment, be someone who was not only surviving. The horses shifted beneath them, restless from standing still, and Caleb said they should get back, and they turned and rode down through the meadow toward Hawthorne Ridge, side by side on the uneven ground, the morning still young and the valley stretching out around them with all its winters and all its distances, and all of it hers to be part of. If she could only keep believing that she'd earned the right to stay. Spring came to the North Valley the way it always did at altitude, reluctantly, in pieces, with several false starts that tricked you into believing winter was finished before it came back one more time to make its point. The snow on the high meadows held through March and into the first weeks of April, and the road from Black Ridge stayed muddy and difficult, and the ranch hands spent the in-between weeks repairing what the winter had damaged, which was considerable. Nathan left on the 14th of April. He had spent the weeks before his departure in a state of energy that Eliza recognized as equal parts excitement and the specific anxiety of a young man who has made a decision and is not entirely sure he's brave enough to follow through on it. He packed and repacked his saddlebags twice. He had 3 separate conversations with Caleb that Eliza could hear from the kitchen, each one starting with practical logistics, the horse he was taking, the route north, the name of the man in Montana, and each one ending somewhere quieter and harder to listen to without feeling like an intruder. The morning he left, Eliza made biscuits and salt pork and strong coffee and set it on the table without ceremony, because ceremony would have made it harder for both brothers, and she understood this without having to think about it. Nathan ate with the appetite of a young man who is nervous and hungry simultaneously, which meant he ate a great deal and talked too much, and knocked over his coffee cup and mopped it up with his sleeve before she could get a rag to it. "Sorry," he said. "It's a table," she said. He looked at her. He had his father's dark coloring and his mother's, she'd gathered from scattered comments, restlessness, and he had spent 6 weeks recovering in this house, and somewhere in those 6 weeks had stopped being the reckless younger brother who complicated things and become, without fanfare, someone she was actually going to miss. "You'll take care of him," Nathan said. It was not a question exactly, but it was also a request. "Your brother doesn't need taking care of," she said. "I know, but he needs someone who doesn't let him close everything off." He picked up his coffee cup, remembered it was empty. "He does that. Shuts things down before they can cost him anything. He's been doing it since—" He stopped. "Since a long time." "I know," she said. "He's different with you," Nathan said. "I noticed it. From when I was still on the cot. He comes in the kitchen and he's different." He set the cup down. "I just wanted to say that. Before I go." Caleb came in from the barn and the conversation moved back to practical things, which was a relief to everyone. Eliza stayed at the stove while the 2 brothers went outside, and she listened to the sounds of Nathan's horse being brought round and the low exchange of voices in the yard, and then a longer silence that she did not try to interpret. When Caleb came back inside, he went directly to the window and stood there for a moment with his back to her. He'll be all right, she said. Yes, Caleb said. He didn't turn around. I know. She left him to it. That was another thing she had learned. The difference between the silences that wanted company and the silences that needed to be left alone. She had gotten better at telling them apart. She was still not always right. The Owen Pratt situation resolved itself in May, in the characteristically undramatic fashion of things that have been properly documented. Pratt had the access road repaired by the second week of the month. She saw the work crew from the North Meadow, small figures moving along the distant line of the road with tools and a wagon. And a second letter arrived from his lawyer, more carefully worded than the first, acknowledging the conditions of the 1868 agreement and committing to their ongoing maintenance. Caleb read the letter at the kitchen table with his coffee. That's the end of it, he said. For now, Eliza said. He looked at her. Men like Pratt don't stop wanting things, she said. He'll wait and look for a different angle, but this particular angle is closed. She refilled his coffee without asking. As long as the documentation stays organized and accessible, you'll see him coming before he gets anywhere. You're going to keep the files organized, he said. Aren't you? I already am keeping the files organized, she said. I have been since February. He looked at his coffee. What would I have done? He said. Not quite a question, almost thinking out loud. You'd have managed, she said. You were managing before I got here. I was surviving, he said, and used her word back at her with the particular precision of a man who had been listening to everything she'd said for 4 months and had not forgotten any of it. She held that for a moment. Yes, she said. I suppose you were. There was a conversation happening between them that had been building for weeks, that had been there in the front room on the evening he'd described watching her get up from the road, that had been in the meadow on the cold Sunday when she'd said she wasn't leaving, and neither of them had named it directly yet, because they were, both of them, people who had learned caution the hard way and who moved at the pace that caution imposed. But it was there. It was as present in the kitchen as the stove and the lamp and the ledger open on her desk. The naming of it happened in June on an ordinary evening without any particular dramatic architecture around it, which felt right. They were on the porch after supper, a habit that had developed in the warming weather, the two of them sitting in the 2 chairs that someone had placed there years ago and that Eliza had never asked about. The valley below was going golden in the late light, the mountains catching the last of it on their peaks, and the ranch was making its evening sounds, the horses in the pasture, the far-off lowing of cattle, the screen door of the bunkhouse. Caleb said, I want to ask you something. All right, she said. He looked at the mountains. He was not a man who performed things, who built to moments with words assembled for effect. And so what he said was direct and unadorned in the way she'd come to understand was his deepest form of respect. I want you to stay, he said. Not as the cook, not as the supply manager. I want you to stay as my wife, if you're willing. I want to build this life with you. He paused. I know this ranch is hard. I know I'm not easy. I know there are things I don't say that I should say more often, and I know you know that already, which is probably part of why I'm asking you instead of someone who doesn't. He turned and looked at her then, and she met his eyes. And there was nothing in his expression that she had to decode or worry about. It was simply him looking at her, meaning exactly what he'd said. She had thought about what it would feel like to be asked this in the abstract, in the way you think about things you've taught yourself not to need. She had expected the familiar bracing, the habit of protective distance, the internal voice that had spent 23 years cataloging reasons why the good thing was not actually available to her. The voice was quiet. I'm willing, she said. He nodded, slowly, as if confirming something he'd believed for a while but had needed to hear. He reached across the distance between the 2 chairs and put his hand over hers on the armrest, and she turned her hand over and they sat that way while the light finished with the mountains and the valley went blue and the first stars appeared over the north ridge. They were married in August. Not a large wedding. Neither of them wanted large, and the ranch in August was too busy for anything elaborate. Clara came, and Hector and all of the ranch hands, and a handful of people from Blackridge who had somewhere between January and August revised their opinion of Eliza Whitmore in light of information that had accumulated whether they'd sought it out or not. Ed from the Mercantile, The doctor who had been snowed in during the January blizzard and who had come to the ranch in the days after and who had looked at Eliza's work on Nathan's leg with professional assessment and said, simply, "You have good hands." Margaret Alcott did not come. Eliza had not expected her to and had not sent an invitation. The ceremony was held in the yard, in the shade of the big cottonwood that stood at the east side of the ranch house, and it was brief and sincere, and the only point at which Eliza came close to losing her composure was when Hector, acting as the closest thing to a father the occasion had, walked beside her across the yard and said quietly, "You earned this." And she had to stop and take a breath before she could keep moving. She did keep moving, she always had. What she had not expected in the weeks following the wedding was the specific quality of the life that assembled itself around her. Not the life she'd imagined in the abstract, not the life described in the letters she'd written to no one during her years at her cousin Helen's house, but something more specific and more difficult and more real than any of those imagined versions. She had not expected that building a life together meant building it out of actual material. Disagreements about provisioning budgets, evenings when Caleb came in exhausted and uncommunicative, and she had to resist the pull of her old habit of making herself invisible in response. Mornings when her hip was bad enough that getting out of bed was a 20-minute negotiation with her own body, and she was short-tempered about it in ways she was not proud of. She had not expected to find that belonging to a place and a person did not resolve the inner argument, the voice that questioned whether she was enough, whether this would hold, whether the good thing was real. That argument didn't end. It just got quieter as the evidence against it accumulated. Caleb was not a man who said things easily, but he was a man who showed up. Every morning, every hard day, every evening when the work had been difficult and the ranch had demanded more than either of them had easily to give. He brought her things he found that he thought she'd want. A better lamp for her desk, a particular reference book on supply management she'd mentioned in passing once, wildflowers from the North Meadow in a chipped mug, placed on her desk without comment. He learned, slowly, to say the things he was thinking instead of only demonstrating them, and she learned, slowly, to receive what was offered without immediately cataloging the ways it might be withdrawn. They were not a perfect couple. They were not a particularly easy couple. They were two people who had both been shaped by difficulty into something functional but guarded, learning, late and carefully, to let the guarding down. That autumn, Eliza began teaching. It had started almost by accident. One of the ranch hand's children, a boy of 9 named Thomas, whose family lived in the small house at the south end of the property, had been watching her work at her desk and had asked what she was writing. She'd shown him the ledger system, expecting him to lose interest within a minute, and instead he'd sat for an hour asking questions about how the columns worked and what the numbers meant. She'd given him a piece of paper and shown him how to set up a basic account, and he'd done it correctly on the first try and looked up at her with an expression she recognized, the particular brightness of a mind that has found something it's good at and knows it. She'd gone to his mother that evening. By December, she had 4 children coming to the ranch house 3 mornings a week. By the following spring, she had 7, ranging in age from 6 to 13, children from the ranch and from 2 of the neighboring spreads whose families had heard, through the valley's efficient informal network, that the woman at Hawthorne Ridge was teaching. She was not a trained teacher. She taught what she knew: reading, writing, basic arithmetic, and the particular kind of practical accounting that she'd taught herself in her cousin's house, and that had in the end been the thing that saved Caleb's water rights and possibly the ranch itself. She taught the children the way she'd learned, not from a position of authority, but from the position of someone who had found these tools useful and wanted to pass them on. Caleb built her a proper space for it in the spring of the following year. Not a school exactly, just a room added to the east end of the ranch house, with windows on 2 sides for light and enough space for a table and 8 chairs. He did a good deal of the carpentry himself, which he was not particularly skilled at, and which showed in the slightly uneven window frames and the door that stuck in wet weather, and which she valued more than she would have valued perfect work, because the imperfection of it was his specifically, and she knew what it had cost him in time he didn't have. She did not tell him this. She told him the door was sticking and handed him a plane. He planed the door with the same wordless competence he brought to everything, and the door still stuck a little in heavy rain, and she stopped mentioning it because she'd come to understand that the sticking door was simply part of the room, like the uneven window frames, like the way the morning light came in at an angle that was exactly right for teaching a child to read. The question of Blackridge was slower to resolve. Margaret Alcott remained what she was, a woman who had made a public judgment and lacked the particular kind of courage required to walk it back. And there was a portion of the town that took its cues from her, as small towns always have people who take their cues from their loudest voices. But towns are also made of individuals, and individuals update. And the update happened person by person over months and years, driven not by Eliza's effort to change minds, but by the simple accumulation of what she did, and who she was, and what the valley came to know about her. Ed from the Mercantile started setting aside books he thought she might want, marking the pages he'd read himself with small slips of paper and notes in the margins in pencil. The doctor in town, whose name was Greaves, consulted her twice on supply management for his small clinic. The school matter spread further than she'd anticipated, and by the second year she had children coming from as far as 6 miles out, their parents driving them in wagons in the early morning and collecting them at midday. Grace Tillman, the woman who had called Caleb's hiring of Eliza an act of charity in the yard that Saturday, came to the ranch in the second year to ask if her youngest daughter could attend. She stood in the doorway of the schoolroom and looked at the table and the chairs and the books arranged on the shelf that Caleb had built and said, "I said something foolish the first time I came here." "Yes," Eliza said. Grace blinked. She'd perhaps expected a softer landing. "You did say something foolish," Eliza said, "and I think you know it, which is why you mentioned it. Your daughter is welcome here on the same terms as everyone else." Grace Tillman's daughter was 7 and sharp as a tack and sat next to Thomas, who was now 11 and had become, in Eliza's private assessment, someone who might one day do serious things with numbers if he had the opportunity, and whose opportunity she was quietly determined to be part of. Nathan wrote from Montana. Not often, yes. He was not a natural correspondent, and his letters had the quality of something he'd been meaning to do for weeks and finally did in one sitting, but regularly enough. The horse operation was working out. The man he'd gone to work for was difficult in productive ways. He had learned things about his own capabilities that he hadn't known he was capable of learning. He wrote once, in the second winter, a letter addressed specifically to Eliza rather than to both of them, which was unusual enough that she opened it with some uncertainty. It was short. He said he'd been thinking about the night of the storm, about lying on that shelf in the dark, believing he was going to stay there, and what it felt like when Caleb appeared out of the snow above him. He said he'd been thinking about the fact that she had been the reason Caleb came from the right direction, and that he understood that, and that he wanted her to know he understood it. He said he hoped his brother was less impossible to live with than he had historically been. He said he thought the answer was probably yes, because she seemed like someone who would fix problems she found and would have found that particular one by now. She read it twice and then set it on her desk and sat with it for a while. She wrote back and told him that his brother was, in fact, still occasionally impossible to live with, and that this was fine, and that Montana sounded cold, and that she hoped the horses were good. He wrote back in 3 weeks, which was fast for Nathan, and said the horses were excellent, and that was really all a person needed. Caleb read the exchange, because they had that kind of marriage, not a secretive one, not a performative one, but an honest one that had been built from honesty and could not be sustained by anything else. And he said, looking at Nathan's first letter, "He never wrote to me like that." "He didn't know you needed to hear it," Eliza said. Caleb was quiet. "Did you?" she asked. "Need to hear it?" He held the letter for a moment. "Yes," he said, which cost him something, and which she received without comment because some things are better received in silence. In the third year, Eliza lost the baby. She had been 4 months along, and it had seemed, by that point, like a thing that was going to happen. And then one morning in November it was no longer happening, and what followed were the worst 3 weeks of her life in a life that had contained some genuine competition for that title. She did not write about this, and she has not spoken of it except to Clara and to Caleb and to the doctor, and this account will not linger in it either, except to say that it was real, and that it changed her, and that she and Caleb came through it in the way that people come through the worst things. Not unchanged, not unscathed, but together, which is the only form of coming through that ultimately counts for anything. What she learned in those weeks, or rather what she knew already, and was forced to know more deeply, was that the people who hold you up in the worst moments are revealing something true about themselves. Clara came and stayed for 4 days without being asked. Hector spoke to Caleb with a gentleness that Eliza didn't see but heard from down the hall, and which made her understand something about the older man that she hadn't fully understood before. The ranch hands moved quieter for a week, which was their way of saying what they didn't have words for. And Caleb, who had spent a lifetime not saying things, sat beside her on the hard evenings and said them, imperfectly, with gaps and wrong words and the occasional retreat into silence when the words ran out, but present, consistently, stubbornly present, which she had come to understand was his fundamental nature underneath all the management and the composure. He was someone who stayed. It was, she thought, the most important thing she had ever learned about him. The following year, their daughter was born in July. They named her Margaret, which confused some people and pleased others, and which Eliza had chosen with complete intention, not to honor Margaret Alcott, but to take the name back, to put it on something that was hers and good, to refuse to let one woman's cruelty own a word. Caleb had looked at her when she proposed it and said, "Are you sure?" And she had said yes, and he had nodded with the particular nod of a man who has long since stopped being surprised by the specific ways his wife is made of something he does not have a name for. Margaret was born noisy and demanding and entirely healthy, and Eliza sat with her in the schoolroom the morning after they came home from the doctor's in Blackridge, in the chair by the window where the light was best, and looked at her daughter's face and felt something she didn't have words for in any language. Not completion, not happiness exactly, which is too small and too temporary a word. Something more like recognition. As if this had been the shape of things all along, and she was only now, sitting in a room her husband had built with uneven window frames in a ranch in the Colorado mountains, catching up to what had always been true. She thought about the boardwalk in January 2 years ago, the bag in the mud, the 30 feet of visibility in the blizzard, the tack room and the survey map, and a cold night in the kitchen with a lamp and a ledger. She thought about Thomas, who was 13 now and could run the supply ledger himself, and who had told her last week, with the offhand certainty of a child who doesn't know yet how remarkable he is, that he wanted to study mathematics at a real school someday. She thought about the sticking door and the uneven window frames and the book of poetry with its worn corners and the 2 chairs on the porch where the valley went gold in the evenings. She thought about being 6 years old and learning to get the answers out fast before anyone could decide she wasn't worth asking. Here is what Eliza Whitmore knew. At 26, sitting in a room she had partly built, in a valley she had partly mapped, holding a daughter she had named with intention. The world is not organized around the principle that people get what they deserve. She had known that from childhood, and nothing she had encountered since had substantially revised it. The world is indifferent and often unkind and full of people like Margaret Alcott who will push your bag into the mud and call it honesty. But the world is also full of survey maps and tack rooms, of east trails that are partially obstructed but not impassable, of men who step down from their horses in sleet and point at a flat rock and say, "Use that," of children who sit down at a table and find out what they're good at, of correspondence files in wooden boxes that have been waiting for years for someone with enough patience and enough purpose to go through them before dawn. What she had learned, what she was still learning imperfectly, on the bad hip days and the hard evenings and the mornings when the old voice rose again with its old arguments, was that worth is not conferred. It cannot be given to you by the right person saying the right thing in the right moment, though that helps. It cannot be taken from you by a woman on a boardwalk or a closed door or a room that goes quiet when you walk in. It exists prior to all of that. It existed in her at 6 years old, teaching herself from books no one told her she needed. It existed on a January road in the sleet. You don't discover your worth by having someone finally see it. You discover it by refusing to stop moving toward what you need, even when your knee is bleeding and the mud is cold and the ranch is 7 miles north and the weather is wrong. You discover it by getting up from the road. The mountains outside the window were green in the July light, the snow line sitting higher than she'd ever seen it, and the sound of the ranch in the morning came in through the open door. Voices, horses, the distant work of the valley going about its particular business. Margaret made a sound against her shoulder, small and specific and entirely her own, and Eliza shifted her and looked out at the mountains and thought that this, all of it, the imperfect door and the hard winters and the man down the hall, who still sometimes went quiet when he should talk, and who was, even now, probably standing at some fence on the north pasture thinking something he would not say until evening. This was the life. Not the life she had imagined in her cousin's spare room, the actual one. Caleb Hawthorne's ranch was known by several names in the valley, depending on who you asked and when. Old-timers called it the Hawthorne Spread, out of habit. The county records called it Hawthorne Ridge. The families of the children who came 3 mornings a week called it, with affection and a degree of informality that would have surprised Caleb's father, the school ranch. But the name Eliza heard most often, in the years that followed, heard from Clara and from Hector and from Ed at the mercantile, and eventually from strangers passing through the valley who had heard of it from other strangers, was simpler than any of those. People called it the place where that woman built something. They meant Eliza. They didn't always know her name, or the story of January, or the East Trail, or the correspondence boxes. They knew only the fact of it, the way facts travel in small places. That a woman had arrived with nothing and had made something real, and that the something real had outlasted the doubt and the mud and every closed door, and was still there, still going, built out of practical intelligence and stubbornness, and the particular kind of love that is not decorative but structural, that holds weight, that keeps the walls up. On the evening of that July day, after Margaret was asleep and the schoolroom was quiet and the ranch had settled into its evening sounds, Eliza sat on the porch in her chair and watched the light go out of the mountains the way she had watched it every clear evening for 2 years. Caleb came and sat in the other chair without saying anything, and they were quiet together in the way they were quiet. Not the absence of communication, but the fullest form of it, the silence that only exists between people who have moved past the need to fill it. After a while, he said, "Thomas asked me today if there was a school in Blackridge that took older students." "There's a school," Eliza said. "It's not very good." "He wants to go further than you can take him here." "I know," she said. "I've known for a year. I've been writing letters." She looked at him. "There's a school in Denver that takes students on scholarship. They're interested in Thomas. They want to see his work." Caleb looked at her. "How long have you been doing this?" he said. "Since February," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in the particular tone he used when he was finding something both completely unsurprising and somehow still remarkable, "You were going to tell me." "I am telling you." "When you had something to tell. When I had something worth telling." She looked at the mountains. "He's going to be extraordinary. He just needs the chance." "Like someone else I know," Caleb said. She looked at him. He was looking at the mountains, not at her, with the particular expression that she had learned over 2 years to read. Not carefully composed, not managed, but simply his. A man who meant things deeply and showed it obliquely, and was, underneath all of it, someone who had been waiting a long time to have someone see the shape of him clearly and not flinch. She reached across and put her hand over his on the armrest, the same way he had on the evening he asked her to stay. The valley below them was going dark in the slow summer way, the light lasting longer than it had any right to, and the stars came out above the north ridge, and the ranch was what it was, imperfect and real and hers, as much as anything is ever anyone's, which is not by possession but by love and work, and the daily choice to stay and keep building, even on the days when the building is hard and the door sticks, and the voice in the back of your mind still wonders if you've got it wrong. She had learned that the wondering doesn't stop. She had learned that it doesn't have to. Step by imperfect step, in a valley she had not known existed until January, in a life she had not known was available to her until she stopped asking for permission to want it. Eliza Whitmore had built something that would outlast the doubt. That was enough. That was everything. But the name Eliza heard most often, in the years that followed, heard from Clara and from Hector and from Ed at the mercantile, and eventually from strangers passing through the valley who had heard of it from other strangers, was simpler than any of those. People called it the place where that woman built something. They meant Eliza. They didn't always know her name or the story of January or the East Trail or the correspondence boxes. They knew only the fact of it, the way facts travel in small places, that a woman had arrived with nothing and had made something real, and that the something real had outlasted the doubt and the mud and every closed door and was still there, still going, built out of practical intelligence and stubbornness, and the particular kind of love that is not decorative but structural, that holds weight, that keeps the walls up. On the evening of that July day, after Margaret was asleep and the schoolroom was quiet, and the ranch had settled into its evening sounds, Eliza sat on the porch in her chair and watched the light go out of the mountains the way she had watched it every clear evening for 2 years. Caleb came and sat in the other chair without saying anything, and they were quiet together in the way they were quiet. Not the absence of communication, but the fullest form of it, the silence that only exists between people who have moved past the need to fill it. After a while he said, "Thomas asked me today if there was a school in Blackridge that took older students." "There's a school," Eliza said. "It's not very good. He wants to go further than you can take him here." "I know," she said. "I've known for a year. I've been writing letters." She looked at him. "There's a school in Denver that takes students on scholarship. They're interested in Thomas. They want to see his work." Caleb looked at her. "How long have you been doing this?" he said. "Since February," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in the particular tone he used when he was finding something both completely unsurprising and somehow still remarkable, "You were going to tell me. I am telling you." "When you had something to tell." "When I had something worth telling." She looked at the mountains. "He's going to be extraordinary. He just needs the chance." "Like someone else I know," Caleb said. She looked at him. He was looking at the mountains, not at her, with the particular expression that she had learned over 2 years to read. Not carefully composed, not managed, but simply his. A man who meant things deeply and showed it obliquely and was, underneath all of it, someone who had been waiting a long time to have someone see the shape of him clearly and not flinch. She reached across and put her hand over his on the armrest, the same way he had on the evening he asked her to stay. The valley below them was going dark in the slow summer way, the light lasting longer than it had any right to, and the stars came out above the north ridge. And the ranch was what it was, imperfect and real and hers, as much as anything is ever anyone's, which is not by possession, but by love and work, and the daily choice to stay and keep building, even on the days when the building is hard and the door sticks, and the voice in the back of your mind still wonders if you've got it wrong. She had learned that the wondering doesn't stop. She had learned that it doesn't have to. Step by imperfect step, in a valley she had not known existed until January, in a life she had not known was available to her until she stopped asking for permission to want it, Eliza Whitmore had built something that would outlast the doubt. That was enough. That was everything.